Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Denny. Welcome.
Thank you.
We're here to talk about a book that you and your co-author published in 2019, Gender, Sexuality, and the Cultural Politics of Men's Identity, Literacies of Masculinity. Tell us what you mean by literacies of masculinity.
So just like any English teachers that you'll meet, we're always thinking about how we teach writing, but also teach reading. They go hand in hand in a lot of ways. I come from a school of thought, a school of philosophy that thinks about how our bodies and how we move through life is also about writing and reading, and that we learn to read one another, but we also learn to send out messages to one another. Obviously one aspect of who we are is our masculinity. Many people understand masculinity in a plurality of masculinities. And however we do masculinity is taught, is sort of imprinted on us. And we as men, cisgender men or people who become men, have to learn that masculinity. We have to learn our different masculinities. So the book sort of launches from that sort of notion and then thinks about the ways in which pop culture plays a role in how we learn, but also teaches us. So we very much see pop culture as teaching us, thinking about how we learn to read and how we learn to write into our masculinities over time.
Good, and we'll be talking about how that's evolved, right? Before we do that, what's the backstory on this? How'd you get started with this project?
So I was talking with my co-author, Rob Monday, about this, and we had many sort of beginnings to this book project. One of them started off with me when I was in graduate school, thinking about coming of age as a gay person, and thinking about how do I negotiate and navigate my way through the world. And think about that. And as you become a gay person, as you claim your identity, as you become self-aware, there's a whole social learning process there. Another beginning was, I used to have a writing assignment in my classes where I'd ask students to think about how gender, how sexuality, how identity is performed, or how it appears in pop culture throughout time. And then I think the big launching point for this book project was thinking about the former president and Billy Bush and the Access Hollywood controversy when they were sort of caught talking like guys in a locker room about men's relationships to women and presumptions of how we interact with women and those sorts of things.
So let's talk about that double standard for a second. I assume that you've looked into this a little bit. I think from my own experience, there are times when I felt that I needed to play that game around other guys, right? That it was an initiation, almost kind of an experience. Have you guys looked into it like that at all? Because you're talking about performing masculinity and about it being a choice, but sometimes maybe it's not a choice. Sometimes we're sort of goaded into some things, right?
And I think when we think of how we're taught our masculinities, it's both choice but also socialization. So it's not necessarily one or the other. Maybe it's both and I think that becomes really, really interesting. When Rob and I were thinking through the whole locker room issue, we started to think about where else besides Access Hollywood has the locker room appeared. And then we started looking and holy cow, locker rooms are everywhere in pop culture. Whether it's looking at the famous Top Gun, elements of that film that are based in the locker room or based on the beach, these men interacting with one another. Right. I was teasing Rob, he didn't know about this. MTV had a great series called Teen Wolf. That had lots of scenes based out of locker rooms where men were interacting with one another, usually high school men, but it's still, I think, really, really interesting. Yeah, and
that Top Gun movie was sort of a celebration of all of those stereotypes. I remember one of the lines was, and I think they're in the locker room, they're talking about the award for Top Gun on display in the lobby or something, and somebody says, "Where's the award for second place?" And I think Val Kilmer says it's in the ladies' room. Right.
There's the double standard right there.
Yeah. So if we try to define this iconic masculinity model, are there some things that, because I want to talk about how this has changed, but are there some things that have just been consistent through time here?
I don't know that. I think it's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
We have to think about our own history in the U.S. and the place of men. When we kind of want to think about notions of masculinity situated in history, think about the 1930s and the place of men during the Depression.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have been a high time for a lot of men.
Yeah.
But then we have World War II. And it's both a great time for a muscular masculinity, but also shifts how women understand their place in society.
Yeah.
The 50s roll around, and a lot of times we look today as the 50s being this like great halcyon period. In a lot of ways it was, but we both know that for a lot of people of color, working class people, it was a difficult time. Then we get into the 60s. Masculinity changes again. We have hippie guys, but we also have the beginnings of very conservative men. And you just keep marching forward, and that performance of identity, that performance of masculinity keeps shifting.
Yeah.
And again, I think of my own perspective, growing up in the 70s as a gay kid, I didn't have any icons to look to. I think of my students today, they have plenty of icons to look to.
Yeah.
I just noticed last night, looking at the news that Colton Underwood, I believe is his name, is getting married to his partner. And who would have thunk that a former football player would be getting great publicity about marrying his partner and not having a huge backlash in the country, around that.
Well, so let's stay with that history view for a minute here. Let's go back real far. Let's go back a couple thousand years. There's this, almost by barbarian times during the Roman Empire, right? And the Christian model is someone who turns the other cheek, right? I mean, so even if you go back that far, you'll see that it seems like there's two different ways of looking at this, right? One where you're having to prove yourself all the time, right? And one where you're refusing to do that.
Yeah,
right?
and I think that those struggles, are trans-historical. I think that they do stand across time.
Yeah.
But I think that we are constantly imprinted with what does the moment tell us about?
Right.
And I think, what I love about the example you're giving is I would love to think about how do we juxtapose that to the young person in high school facing conflict.
Sure.
Today, would we react the same way to conflict? Yeah. Or no, depending on where we are, depending on, where in the country, how we've been educated, how our parents have coached us.
I think in the world that I grew up in prior to the 60s, because everything changed in the 60s, but prior to that, I think a lot of what we associated with masculinity was kind of defined by that Hemingway myth character. You're an English professor, so you must be familiar with that. I mean, how do you understand that? Because Hemingway actually had problems living up to the myth that he was creating, right?
Yeah, and
what are your thoughts on that?
Once again, sort of case in point of here is a man that we build up and a man who struggles under that pressure to live up to the ideal that he supposedly is supposed to be performing according to. But I also think of contemporaries. I think of a James Baldwin. Why isn't he an iconic male? There's lots of reasons why, or you can go through all sorts of literature. I also think of 1950s Marlon Brando. There's a working class masculinity that's the beginnings of a sort of sensitive male.
And that's the beginnings of the change, I think.
Yeah.
In the 50s. So in the 50s, it's these outcast beat characters, right? And that's a very different take on this than what you see in Hemingway. And I think Norman Mailer kind of perpetuated that Hemingway-esque image, but you see these other these films and some of these other writers cutting against that.
Well, you think of Allen Ginsberg and other folks that were coming out as queer identified before necessarily we were using LGBTQ plus words.
Yeah. And then in the 60s, it evolves again. It seems like in the 60s we toying with those earlier ideas again, right? You have who's the guy who was the first nude male to pose in the women's magazine?
I'm blanking on that myself.
He was the Burt Reynolds.
Yeah, that's
Burt
what we were
Reynolds,
talking
yeah.
about, Burt Reynolds.
Burt Reynolds, yeah.
I think we're in a really complex place where it's no longer just binary notions of gender and masculinity. We have to think in terms of continuums. I think of, I'm really drawn to the example of Caitlyn Jenner that we write about, who themselves has to develop a sense of femininity based on a lifetime of masculinity.
Yeah.
I think, when I was growing up in the 70s, their former identity was iconic male, and they no longer are that.
Yeah.
So that becomes interesting. I think we are in an interesting place politically where we want to legislate identities, particularly around trans issues. I think of all around the country, states are trying to pass bills, regulating who can perform in what sports and however we want to imagine that. Interestingly, we don't seem to be regulating masculinity around that. So when you think of sports figures, we're always interrogating what counts as a woman in those conversations, but rarely do we have a conversation about what does it mean to be a man, and what are the limits, what are the possibilities.
Yeah. And somebody who gets caught up in that is Colin Kaepernick, right? I mean, he does something that. Tell me what you wrote about that, because I know you talked.
Yeah,
about
we
that.
were really fascinated by the example of Colin Kaepernick doing what I imagine to be part of a long history of African American protest, and as we all know, there was a huge negative reaction to him. Performing his identity, performing his masculinity in a particular way that I want to juxtapose to Charlotte or to January 6th. And that gets us thinking about how there's a significant difference between how white masculinity is accepted, what parameters are allowed, versus what, particularly African American men, how they are policed, how they are surveilled. I think about how any of us would walk through a city and how we would be treated differently, depending on how we present as men.
And so these January 6th riots, you're seeing that as an expression of, for the people that were involved in this, expression of their masculinity. They were acting out.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look at the January 6th protests, I can't help but think of the faces that were captured on TV, on film, on photographs, digital, everywhere, of these angry faces. These very angry men, mostly white men. And, how are we negotiating that? What's that telling us? What's that teaching other young men coming up in society? I think on some level, personally, I think it's troubling that kind of angry masculinity, what some might call toxic masculinity, represents a significant portion of the population. But I also think of other people that are trying to push back at that, and where are we as a society? What's that teaching us?
It's interesting. You think of that as this angry masculinity. I mean, that's really what football kind of represents too, right? You get these guys getting psyched up in the locker room and then coming out and trying to break one another's bones, basically. And it's interesting that Kaepernick, in order to make his point, did something that was very opposite of that. He had a very passive way of protesting, right? He just took a knee, and it made a point, right? I mean, it really, I think possibly because of the gender connotations there,
and was as best I can tell from looking at how he's been represented in pop culture, he was very respectful, very smart, very interested in how does he build a movement rather than alienate people. Obviously, he turned people off, doing that, but I think he also galvanized people. There's a dignity in how he protested, but there's also a horror in how people responded to him.
Well, and I think the measure of his effectiveness is the extent to which other football players who dissed what he was doing had to apologize and recant what they'd said, right? Because of the pressure that was put on him.
And he goes on to film a really beautiful commercial for Nike that
Yeah.
talks about protest rhetoric and whatnot.
Yeah.
And what's the message in that ad is about embracing and respecting difference. And once again, here is a young man that we should be celebrating. We should be valorizing, but in a lot of parts of this country, we look down on that.
Yeah.
And again, we want to think about, what does that teach us? What does that tell other young men coming up? What's appropriate, what's not appropriate?
Yeah.
And I'm hoping people are getting the mixed, complex message there. That maybe some of us want to be Colin. Maybe some of us want to perform our identity in the ways that he is.
Yeah. When you talk about modulating masculinity, in other words, it's not that that each of us has one image that we're always putting forward, but that we adjust as we mature. We adjust from one situation to another, right? How does that work?
Well, in my own situation, I think that again, I have privilege as a middle class going on senior citizen male.
Yeah.
I think how I move through the world most of the time is safe. But I also think there are any number of times in my former life living in New York, but also living down in West Lafayette, that people will. The worst insult that they can hurl at you is to call you a sexual epithet. I think that still goes on to this day. But I also am very aware of how privileged I am that for the most part I walk through life and can pass, as you can. And I think that becomes really, really interesting.
Well, and hopefully we're not around the sort of people that are going to do that in the first place, right?
Yeah, but the thing that always gives me pause is, I think, where would I not be safe? And I think where I love coming up to Chicago. Where in Chicago would I be safe to be who I am, whatever that is at a given moment, versus being on Halsted Street in Boys Town, where I can be a little bit different, a little bit more who I want to be in terms of my sexual identity. But if I'm outside of the United Stadium or Soldier Field, I might have to perform differently, or if, depending on where we are in the country. Where are we safe? Where are we not safe? And again, I come back to, how is it that I'm safe doing that? But we also have to think about women in our lives are constantly having to think about modulating how they perform their identities, but also people of color. So we're in I think, a really interesting place in our culture where men finally have to stop and think, how am I performing who I am? I suspect neither you nor I, if we're driving down 80, 90, or 65, we don't fear being pulled over by police, but other people do. And again, that's, I think, because we're white men. And again, I don't think we have enough conversations about that. And how do we teach young men going through life, how do you perform who you are? It's sort of cliche at this point that most people of color have to have conversations with their teenage sons about how they encounter authority. That how you and I do our masculinity gets treated differently than other people. And again, that's coming back to full circle, that's about how do we write and how do we help people read our masculinities.
What's also interesting about that, though, is that that our identity isn't static. That it ebbs and flows. And one of the examples was the James Bond character, right? The Sean Connery version, and then the Daniel Craig version, right? And you were explaining that was that the last. No, it was a couple back, right? I don't remember which one it was, but tell us about that.
Well, I thought it was really powerful to watch, James Bond as Daniel Craig being romanced by a man. Javier Bardem, caressing him, touching him. And they were flirting with each other in sort of a prison motif at one point in the movie. And that's something you would have never seen back in the 60s or 70s with either Sean Connery or Roger Moore. It was just a very different performance of masculinity.
Very unchanging.
And I think, just the bodies. There's a famous scene early on when Daniel Craig is the new Bond, where he's coming out of a beach, coming out of the water, and the camera's gazing on his body
Yeah.
in a very different way than we would have ever seen, with Sean Connery or others.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
so that's a whole
Connery
conversation.
probably didn't look that good.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but that's a whole conversation that we could have is about how men's bodies, Daniel Craig is an example of that, the hard body, the athletic body. I aspire to be like that. I probably never will be like that.
Right.
But I also think of how young people in our society face that pressure, that's the ideal body, is athletic, is hard.
Yeah. Yeah, we all want to look like Daniel Craig, but we settle for not looking like Orson Welles.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. You mentioned prison motif here, right?
Yeah.
What's the prison masculinity situation? Because there seems like it's a whole different game, And I know this from watching movies, and I'm assuming there's some accuracy there.
We didn't write too much about that, but there is a whole history there in pop culture, I think, right off the top of my head from Shawshank Redemption, that one of the storylines in that film and one of the high points is, male-on-male sexual assault is the biggest assault, the worst assault of all. Similarly, I think of Oz, the famous, I think it was an HBO series about a decade ago, similar, where, men play out their masculinities, but also their sexualities in power politics that are very meaningful.
Yeah. Now, at the Lafayette campus, you work with the owl.
My other life.
And you had an incident with the owl that maybe you could tell us about. I guess we need to explain what it is.
Yeah. Which part?
Well, what is the owl?
The owl is a famous website, owl.purdue.edu. It's been around for about 25, 26 years. And on any given day, about 300,000 people use it to get advice on writing.
So it's not just for students, it's anybody in the country can
we know that people from government, business, high schools, all around the world use the site to get support around writing. And I think the controversy that you're referring to is we have a page still have a page on the site that gives people advice on how to avoid gender bias around the use of how you write. And one of the things that any good writing teacher will tell you, and I'm sure you've told this to your students, never make assumptions about your audience. And the world has changed. As we both know, you can't write with the assumption that your readership are all men.
Right.
So that page was, basically taking that up and saying, hey, when you're writing, be respectful of your audience and be inclusive. That got taken up in certain circles as somehow we were proposing to ban the use of the word man, which became a very big controversy. And
as if you could possibly do that, right? I mean,
as if I would want to. I joked to people at the time, I'm pretty out about my identity, and I said I actually like men, so why would I want to ban them?
Right.
But still, the situation remained that was very controversial for people to think about. Why? Would you want to write in a way that encouraged gender bias? So to this day, I think it's an interesting controversy. Of course, we would never encourage the banning of any word. I think that would be the worst thing ever. But we always want people to think about when they communicate, when they write, when they work with one another, don't make assumptions. And that seemed like a pretty simple message, but it also tells you about the moment in time that we are.
I almost don't think that's really what it was about. I think they were just using that as an excuse to raise the issue, right?
Yeah.
Did anything come of that? I mean,
a lot of controversy, a lot of stress for my staff. You might imagine that a lot of the controversy around the country and the response to it was assuming that my staff were all women. And so there were people that are, problematic that would write to my staff and accuse them of being X, Y, and Z. And it was painful. And we had to, change the owl in such a way that, people wouldn't know what students had created what content. Because people would target them and, assume that they were angry women going after men, which wasn't the case.
It's a big political issue. It's not talked about all the time, but it's always looming beneath the surface. So what do you recommend about pronouns and things? If I call the owl and I say, should I use he, she, or they here? What's your policy?
I would say, as a good rhetorician, I want to hear what your context is and how are you wanting to reach your audience. And so if it is a mixed audience and you don't know, you use plural pronouns.
Yeah.
If you are having a conversation with someone and you don't know, you ask.
Yeah.
It's sort of a standard practice in a lot of academia to have people announce their pronouns. And I think that that's an individual, campus by campus, class by class decision, but I think the message is still there, is really good. If you don't understand your audience, ask.
Sure. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Harry Denny for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.